I stood in my studio, the familiar hum of the sewing machine filling the space as sunlight spilled through the large windows, casting a golden hue over the spools of fabric stacked neatly on shelves. This place was my sanctuary. I had built it from the ground up, pouring every ounce of passion and determination into each stitch, every sketch, every design. The scent of freshly cut fabric mingled with the faint aroma of coffee in the corner, where a half-empty cup waited for me. I paused, leaning against the cutting table, and sighed. 37. A number that both weighed on me and reminded me of how much I had endured. The lines of my life were stitched with resilience, though they weren't always visible. On the outside, people saw a beautiful, young, modern woman who carried herself with grace. But that beauty, that strength, no one ever seemed to see past it. Not even my ex-husband. 5 years ago, I had walked away from him and the constraints he wrapped around me like suffocating fabric. He used to call my work a hobby, a phase that wouldn't amount to anything. He scoffed at my short skirts, told me to tone down my makeup, criticized the way I carried myself as though my light was something meant to be dimmed. I had tried to fit into his mold until the day I realized that bending didn't mean compromising. It meant breaking. So I left. For me. For my son. Mom. I heard his voice before I saw him. A soft knock followed, and then the door to my studio creaked open. Come in, sweetheart, I called, pushing aside the swirl of memories. Ethan stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room with warmth. At 17, he had inherited his father's height but none of his coldness. His smile was genuine, his eyes kind, a softness I prayed he'd never lose. When I told him I was leaving his father, I had braced myself for rebellion, for anger. But instead he had hugged me tightly and said, "I'm staying with you, Mom. I believe in you." That belief had carried me through more sleepless nights than I could count. Need a break? Ethan asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. I chuckled, setting aside the fabric I'd been pinning. Maybe. How was school? Boring, he said, wrinkling his nose. But I have news. Oh. I arched a brow. He stepped closer, pulling out his phone. Mrs. Hampton loved the jacket you made for me. Now half the basketball team wants one. I laughed, shaking my head. I don't know if I have time to become the team's personal designer. He grinned, that mischievous glint lighting up his face. You're already famous in our school, Mom. They think you're a genius. The words hit me unexpectedly, and for a second I had to steady myself. After years of being told that my work was insignificant, hearing my son proudly boast about it filled a crack I didn't realize was still there. I guess I owe you commission then, I joked, ruffling his hair. He ducked away, laughing. No way. But maybe you could teach me how to sew sometime. That caught me off guard. You want to learn? Yeah. I've been watching you and it's pretty cool. Besides, I figure it's something we could do together. I swallowed the lump in my throat. It wasn't just about sewing. It was about the connection we had, something I'd fought to protect since the divorce. Course, Ethan. I'd love that. He smiled, and for a moment the weight of the world disappeared. But later that night, as I sat alone in the living room, sketching out designs for a new project, the silence crept in again. It wasn't the peaceful kind, but the one that reminded you of what was missing. I traced a line on the paper and paused, staring at the unfinished sketch. Would I ever be seen for more than just a mother? More than a seamstress hidden behind her work? Can't sleep. Ethan's voice pulled me from my thoughts. He stood in the doorway, wearing sweatpants and a hoodie. His hair tousled as if he had just rolled out of bed. Something like that, I murmured. He walked over and plopped onto the couch beside me, glancing at the sketchbook in my lap. New designs. I nodded, closing the book. Just ideas. He leaned back, resting his head on the couch. You know, Mom, you don't give yourself enough credit. You're amazing. The simplicity of his words unraveled me. Ethan. No, really, he said, sitting up and turning to face me. You've been through so much, and you're still standing. You've built this entire business on your own, and you're raising me. That's more than most people could do. Tears pricked my eyes. You're the reason I'm still standing, I whispered. He smiled softly, his hand resting briefly on mine before he stood. Come on. You need sleep. Tomorrow we'll start on that sewing lesson. As I watched him disappear down the hallway, I realized that maybe I didn't need the world to see me. Ethan saw me. And that was enough. For now. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm I hadn't known before. A rhythm where Ethan and I moved not just as mother and son but as two people who had found comfort in each other's presence. I taught him how to sew, our fingers brushing against fabric as I guided his hands. His focus intense but always punctuated by playful remarks. His talent surprised me, but it was his attentiveness that caught me off guard. Maybe creativity runs in the family, I teased one afternoon as he completed a seam flawlessly. Or maybe I have the world's best teacher. He said with a grin that made my heart flutter in a way I wasn't prepared for. I laughed it off, but that feeling lingered. He started spending more time in the studio, lounging on the old sofa near my work table while I sewed. Sometimes he'd stretch out with a book, but I'd catch him watching me instead. His gaze warm and steady. It wasn't the way a child looked at their parent. It was something else. Something deeper, more searching. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to teenage admiration. But then the compliments started. It began innocently. "You look nice today," he said one morning as I slipped into a fitted dress for a client meeting. I had paused, surprised by the sincerity in his voice, before thanking him and moving on. Then it became more frequent. "You don't look a day over 25, you know that," he'd say as we sat on the couch together, flipping through old photo albums. His fingers brushed mine as he turned a page. "Honestly, Mom, you could walk into my school and no one would guess you're my mother." I laughed, flustered. "That's sweet of you, but I doubt it." "I'm serious," he insisted, his gaze lingering on me longer than it should. "You're beautiful." The weight of his words pressed against my chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. There was something different about the way he said it, as though he wasn't just stating a fact but sharing a secret. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying my reflection. My hair fell in soft waves past my shoulders, and my skin, though not as smooth as it had been in my 20s, still held its glow. Ethan's words played on repeat in my mind, making me see myself differently, through his eyes. I traced the curve of my cheek and wondered when he had started noticing these things. When had I started noticing him noticing? The line between us, once so clear, was beginning to blur, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. The next evening we were in the living room again, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls as we watched a movie. Ethan sat beside me, closer than usual, his arm resting along the back of the couch. I tried to focus on the film, but the warmth of his presence drew my attention. I could feel his gaze on me, even when I wasn't looking. "You're talented, you know that," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the sketchbook on the coffee table. "Everything you create, it's amazing. I don't think you realize how much people admire you." His words hit me harder than they should have, and I felt my cheeks flush. "I just do what I love." "And you do it beautifully," he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. The air between us thickened, the unspoken emotions swirling like a storm on the horizon. I should have changed the subject, laughed it off, done anything but sit there and let his words sink in. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence wrap around us, heavy and charged. When the credits rolled, I stood abruptly, my pulse racing. "I should get to bed," I said, my voice shaky. Ethan stood too, his hand brushing mine as he reached for the remote. "Good night, Mom," he said softly, his gaze lingering on me for a second too long. I nodded and walked away, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts I couldn't control. Upstairs, as I lay in bed, the echo of his voice stayed with me. The way he said beautiful, the way his hand had lingered on mine. It wasn't my imagination. Something had changed. Something I wasn't ready to face. But as the days passed, I found myself craving those moments. His compliments, his gaze, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. It was intoxicating, and no matter how much I told myself it was wrong, I couldn't shake the pull. And deep down I wasn't sure I wanted to. "Mom," he had said, leaning against the kitchen counter with that playful smirk he'd developed in the past year. "Think you could make me some custom pants? You've got all the talent in the world. Why not spoil your son?" I'd laughed, brushing off the flutter in my chest as I wiped my hands on a dish towel. "I suppose I could." He had taken a step closer, his voice lowering just a bit. "Then I'll come by the studio tomorrow for a fitting. I want them to be perfect." The way he said it, so self-assured, playful yet confident, had sent an unexpected thrill through me. I had turned away quickly, trying to mask the warmth rising in my cheeks. And now, here I was waiting for him. The clock ticked steadily, but my pulse wasn't keeping the same calm rhythm. I adjusted a few sketches on my work table, trying to distract myself, but nothing seemed to help. When the door to the studio finally opened and Ethan stepped in, I realized that no amount of preparation could have settled me. He stood there, framed by the doorway, wearing a fitted t-shirt that clung to his chest and jeans that hung low on his hips. His hair was slightly messy, as if he'd just run a hand through it, and the easy confidence in his posture was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat before I reminded myself to breathe. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice warm and casual. But there was something more in his eyes, something knowing. "Hi," I replied, cursing the slight tremble in my voice as I cleared my throat. "Ready for your fitting?" "Course. I've been looking forward to this," he said as he stepped further into the room. His gaze swept over the fabric, the sketches, the sewing machine, before settling back on me. "This place suits you." I smiled, grateful for the compliment but wary of how his presence made me feel. "Let's get started, then." I guided him to the platform where I usually worked with clients and pulled out my measuring tape. Ethan watched me intently as I knelt in front of him, beginning with the measurements for his waist and hips. My fingers brushed against the fabric of his jeans, and I felt him shift slightly. Whether it was intentional or not, the closeness between us felt overwhelming. "You've done this a million times, right?" he asked, his voice low and playful. "Of course," I replied, trying to focus on the task at hand. But when I looked up, his gaze was already on me, warm and steady. For a moment, the air between us seemed to thicken, and I forgot where I was, who I was. I saw not just my son but a man standing before me, exuding a quiet, masculine confidence that left me breathless. My hands faltered, the measuring tape slipping slightly as I tried to regain my composure. "Careful, Mom," he teased, his lips curving into a knowing smile. "You might make a mistake." I exhaled sharply, giving him a playful glare to cover my nerves. "Don't distract me then." Ethan chuckled softly, but there was something about the sound that made my skin tingle. I moved to measure the length of his legs, kneeling at his feet. My fingers brushed against his ankle, and I felt a heat rise in me, something primal and dangerous. I kept my eyes on the measuring tape, but I was acutely aware of the way his gaze never left me. When I looked up, his eyes were darker, his expression unreadable. My breath caught in my throat. "Everything okay?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yes," I lied, my voice barely a whisper. But it wasn't okay. Something was boiling inside me, something I wasn't sure how to control. My heart raced as I stood up, avoiding his gaze and moving to jot down the measurements in my notebook. My hands shook slightly as I wrote, and I prayed he didn't notice. Ethan stepped down from the platform, closing the distance between us. "You seem a little flustered, Mom," he said softly. I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded natural. "I'm just focused." "Focused on what?" His voice was teasing, but there was a weight to his words that made me look up. He was standing closer than he should have been, his presence enveloping me. "The pants," I managed to say, though my voice wavered. He smiled, slow and deliberate, as if he knew exactly what effect he had on me. "Good. I want them to be perfect." I swallowed hard, willing myself to step back, to create some distance between us. But instead I stood frozen, caught in the pull of something I couldn't name. "I'll finish them soon," I said quickly, turning toward the sewing machine to break the moment. Ethan lingered for a moment longer before stepping back. "Take your time," he said, his voice softer now. "I like spending time here." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. When the door finally closed behind him, I exhaled sharply, my hand gripping the edge of the work table as if it could steady me. My thoughts raced, tangled with emotions I couldn't sort through. What was happening to me? For years I had been a mother first, a woman second. But in that moment, standing in my studio, I realized the balance was shifting. And it scared me. But it also thrilled me. "Would you show me how to take measurements on someone?" The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated for a moment. "You want to learn?" "Yeah," he said, sitting beside me. "I want to know how you do it." I swallowed, unsure if this was a good idea. But his enthusiasm disarmed me, and before I could think it through, I nodded. "'Kay. Let's do it." We returned to the studio, the air quiet and still. I handed him the measuring tape and stood in front of him, explaining the basics. "Start at the shoulders," I instructed. "Make sure the tape isn't too tight." He stepped behind me, his fingers grazing the back of my neck as he adjusted the tape. I held my breath, focusing on the numbers he read aloud. "Is this right?" he asked softly, his breath warm against my ear. He nodded. "Yeah, that's good." His hands moved down to my waist, wrapping the tape around me. My skin burned beneath his touch, and the silence between us felt heavier with each passing second. When he knelt to measure my legs, I felt his gaze lift, meeting mine for just a moment. The intensity in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I exhaled shakily, my words barely a whisper. "That's it." But neither of us moved. He stood slowly, the measuring tape forgotten as his hand brushed my arm. "Mom," he murmured, his voice gentle but charged. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though my breath was unsteady. "I don't know." He hesitated for only a moment before he leaned in, his forehead resting lightly against mine. My heart raced, the warmth of the moment wrapping around us. When his lips brushed mine, soft and hesitant, I felt a rush of emotion that left me breathless. It was brief, but enough to shake me. I stepped back, the weight of reality crashing down on me. "Ethan." "I know," he said softly, his gaze searching mine. "I'm sorry if I—" "No," my voice trembled, but I meant it. "It's not that." He nodded, stepping back and giving me space. "I'll go." I watched him leave, my heart still pounding. In the stillness of the studio, I pressed my fingers to my lips, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The boundaries between us had shifted, and I knew things wouldn't be the same. But a part of me wasn't sure I wanted them to be.